Always dropping the mic, always dropping the mic.
Yeah. Take my picture. All right. Are you part of it?
Jason and Dyke.
All right, will the attorneys approach? All right, will the attorneys, please, the attorney.
Morning, Judge. Joe McMahon for the people of the state of Illinois.
Jody Gleason on behalf of the state.
Joe Cohen on behalf of the state.
Marilyn Hyde Ross for the state.
Dan Weiler for the state.
Morning, Dan Herbert on behalf of Jason Van Dyke.
Randy Bruton on behalf of Jason Van Dyke.
Elizabeth Fleming on behalf of Jason Van Dyke.
Stephen Wise for the state.
All right, at this time, the jury is on their way here. Again, so just housekeeping. Now we have Mr. McMahon, you brought a computer that's stripped down on the data.
Yes, we did, Judge, yes.
So what will be going back to the jury? So you have yours on there too.
All right, so I don't know. I can see.
The defense has a USB drive with the PowerPoint exhibits that were admitted into evidence that we provided to the state, and then
Have you done that already?
we have not done that yet.
When were you done?
We can do it right now.
All right, so we're in recess, we're waiting on the jury, then, once they get settled and everything else, we're gonna start. Everybody knows that we're supposed to be here 15 minutes before we started. Time that was 9 o'clock, so we're good as far as, so.
Judge, just one question. Are you gonna let the jurors go back after the state's initial close? We have to set up a computer. I don't really care how you want to do it, Judge, but we might have a minute lag.
Well, I'm letting you know here, how about this? It's 10 after 9, set up the computer right now.
We can't because the state's has their computer set up.
Well, how long does it take to plug in? All right, step back a little bit. Come up a little bit. How long is it gonna take you to set up?
3 minutes.
And I'm gonna have to walk them back.
I just want
No,
to
you did bring up a good point. After, the defense is closing, I'm gonna have a short recess. And the mistake was we caught because the instructions are out. So then I'll do the instructions right after. Okay, all right, so, but, if you get, run into any difficulty, then we'll just have to take a recess. So you know. All right, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Parts of recesses.
All right. This honorable branch of the Circuit Court of Cook County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Vincent Gahn is now presiding. There's absolutely no talking while court's in session. You may be seated.
Call the case, please.
Jason Van Dyke.
All right, the jury's ready.
Yes, sir.
Everybody else is ready. We're all set out there. Or get anybody in the hallway that we can get in. All right, we're ready to go. All right, bring the jury out.
All rise for the jury.
Will everybody please be seated? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You all know the two questions, so is there anybody in our wonderful jury panel that cannot answer the questions? No, please raise your hand. You're outstanding. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're at the conclusion of the trial. Basically, here's what's going to happen. After my remarks, the attorneys will address what we call closing arguments. And closing arguments are a discussion of the facts that have been proven at trial, reasonable inferences to be drawn from the facts, along with circumstantial evidence. Anything that the lawyers say in closing arguments is not to be considered as evidence. And as you've seen, these are very professional attorneys with high integrity. So this is just a quality control admonishment. Anything that the attorneys say in closing arguments that conflicts with your individual recollection of the evidence should be disregarded. Following closing arguments, I will read the instructions of law that you are to follow in this case. You'll get these instructions in writing along with your verdict forms for your deliberation. When you go back to the jury room to begin your deliberation, your first duty will be to select your foreperson. She or he will preside during all of your deliberation. You have, I'm telling you, you might get sick of it, but it has to be said. You've just been outstanding. Everybody's been paying attention. Nobody can get a better jury than this. Also, I want to thank you right now. So, all right, at this time, closing out. Stay.
Laquan McDonald was never going to walk home that night. The defendant decided that on the way to the scene. You heard what it was that he said. I guess we'll have to shoot him. It wasn't the knife in Laquan's hand that made the defendant kill him that night. It was his indifference to the value of Laquan's life. From the time the defendant fired that very last shot, and Officer Velez immediately picked up the telephone and called the Fraternal Order of Police, the police union. This case has been about exaggerating the threat and trying to hide behind the police shield. Why? Because there's no justification for shooting Laquan McDonald that night. Not one shot, not the first shot, not the 16th shot. Okay, let's get one thing straight here. Laquan McDonald is not on trial. How can anything about his troubled life possibly have impacted the defendant when he made the decision to shoot? The defendant knew nothing about Laquan McDonald. Now, as Mr. McMahon told you in opening statement, police officers can use deadly force in very limited situations. And the judge is going to instruct you on the law. And the judge will instruct you that in each of those situations, an officer can only use deadly force when it's reasonable and necessary. When a police officer puts on his uniform, he knows that he can only use deadly force when it's reasonable and necessary. You know, from the minute that an officer enters the police academy, they're taught that. You even heard from a witness on the stand who's an attorney who taught when the defendant went through the academy, they're taught that they only can use deadly force in very limited situations when it's reasonable and necessary. Now, we all know society allows a police officer to carry a deadly weapon. An officer can order you to stop. An officer can tell you to do something. An officer can even arrest you for certain situations. However, they do not have the right to use deadly force just because you will not bow to their authority. Just because Laquan McDonald was ignoring him that night, he did not have the right to use deadly force. We all know that authority can be abused. And an officer knows that when he abuses his authority and uses deadly force when it's not reasonable and necessary, he has to be held accountable. This is not the Wild West out here, when an officer can shoot an individual using deadly force and then try to justify it later. We know the defendant contemplated the decision to shoot Laquan before he even got out of his vehicle, before he even laid eyes on Laquan McDonald at the scene. When he was a block and a half away, he was contemplating shooting him. And he never adjusted that mindset once he got onto the scene to see what was really happening. He shot too early, he shot too often, and he shot for way too long. He fired 16 shots into Laquan McDonald's body where no reasonable police officer could believe it was necessary. Not the first shot, and certainly not the 16th shot. What was Laquan doing? He was veering away from the officer. He was surrounded by police officers, and an officer with a taser was 30 seconds away. There's a clip within like 2 seconds. Officer Walsh is going to kick the knife out of from the line. Jerry just kicked the knife. There's Officer Ivankovich arriving on the scene with the taser. It's about 25 seconds after he kicked the knife from Laquan's hand. The judge is going to instruct you as to the law. And he's going to tell you that under the law, the defendant can be found not guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of first-degree murder, or guilty of second-degree murder. I'm going to read the jury instruction and tell you what it is that we have to prove for the defendant to be found guilty of first-degree murder. It's sort of long, so bear with me. To sustain the charge of either first-degree murder or the charge of second-degree murder, the state must prove the following propositions. The first proposition: the defendant performed the acts which caused the death of Laquan McDonald. Second proposition: that when the defendant did so, he intended to kill or do great bodily harm to Laquan McDonald, or he knew that such acts would cause death to Laquan McDonald, or he knew that the acts created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm. And the third proposition: the defendant was not justified in using the force which he used. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that any one of these propositions has not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, your deliberation on these charges should end, and you should return the verdict of not guilty of first-degree murder. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that each one of these propositions has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, then you should go on with your deliberations to decide whether a mitigating factor has been proved so that the defendant is guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder. You may not consider whether the defendant is guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder until and unless you first determine that the state has proved beyond a reasonable doubt each of the previous stated propositions. The defendant has the burden of proving by the preponderance of the evidence that a mitigating factor is present, so that he is guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder. By this, I mean that you must be persuaded, considering all the evidence in this case, that it is more probable true than not true that the following mitigating factor is present: that the defendant, at the time he performed the acts which caused the death of Laquan McDonald, believed the circumstances to be such that they justified the deadly force he used, but his belief that such circumstance existed was unreasonable. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that the defendant has proved by a preponderance of the evidence that the mitigating factor is present, so that he is guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder instead of the first-degree murder, you should find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that the defendant has not proved by a preponderance of the evidence that the mitigating factor is present, so that he is guilty of the lesser offense of second-degree murder instead of first-degree murder, you should find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. So these are the three propositions that the state has to prove. We have to prove, one, that the defendant performed the acts that caused the death of Laquan McDonald. That's been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. We know the defendant fired those 16 shots that killed Laquan McDonald. The second proposition that we have to prove is that when the defendant did so, one, he intended to kill or do great bodily harm to Laquan McDonald. Well, he certainly knew that when he was firing 16 shots into the body of Laquan McDonald that he was going to kill him or do great bodily harm, or he knew that such acts would cause death to Laquan McDonald. Well, certainly we know that if you fire a gun into somebody 16 times, you're probably going to cause death. Or he knew that such acts created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Laquan McDonald. Certainly the defendant knew at the time that he was firing each one of those shots that he was creating a strong probability of death or great bodily harm to Laquan McDonald. The third proposition is that the defendant was not justified in using the force which he used. And ladies and gentlemen, that's what's at contention here. The defendant was not justified in using the force. And what do we mean by that? It wasn't necessary. Laquan wasn't doing anything at that moment that made it necessary to kill him, to use deadly force, to shoot him 1 time versus 16 times. The defendant had a million other options that he could have used other than firing that gun. And the biggest one he could have used was time, patience. We know that that taser car arrived within 25 seconds or so from Walsh kicking that gun away from Laquan. There was absolutely no justification for the defendant using deadly force.
Just a correction, if there was, we kicked the knife out.
I'm sorry. Often people have a misperception about what we have to prove, and they think that you have to prove that murder was premeditated. You're never going to get an instruction that there's anything about premeditation in this case. The instructions that I just read to you and the 3 propositions, that's what we have to prove. Now, we don't have to prove that all shots kill Laquan. You can find him guilty of first-degree murder if you believe just one of the bullets killed him. However, we know from the evidence in this case that Laquan McDonald needed every drop of blood in his body. Why? Because the cause of death from gunshot wounds, basically, he bled to death. So every one of those shots contributed to his death. They shortened his life. Maybe he would have lived a little bit longer if he hadn't been shot all of those times. And you know, it's undisputed. Both pathologists testified that when the Laquan died from multiple gunshot wounds. Now, the defendant is also charged with the offense of aggravated battery with a firearm. And the judge is going to read you this instruction, and it's much shorter. To sustain the charge of aggravated battery with a firearm, the state must prove the following proposition: that the defendant intentionally caused injury to another person. Second proposition, that the defendant did so by discharging the firearm. And third proposition, that the defendant was not justified in using the force which he used. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that each one of these propositions has not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant not guilty. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that each one of these propositions has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant guilty. So for aggravated battery of a firearm, we have to prove 1, that the defendant intentionally caused injury to another person. Juan McDonald. Obviously, he intentionally caused injury when he shot him 16 times. The second proposition is that he did so by discharging a firearm. We all know he shot him. He discharged his firearm. And again, the third proposition, that he was not justified in using that force because the force was not necessary. Each of these 16 bullets caused injury to Laquan. From the first shot to the 16th shot. You saw this by when both pathologists, I think, testified. Laquan's body was riddled with bullets. He had 8 bullet wounds that went in one part of his body and out the other. He had 8 bullet wounds that went in and the bullets stayed in. You saw that. That's the grazed wound to the head. You saw that. Multiple shots to the chest area. The one right by his armpit. One on the other side of his body. Chest, multiple gunshot wounds. That was to his elbow there. There was one to his back. The close-up of that one to the back. And they had like bullets, fragments in his mouth. His body was riddled, broken, and bleeding when the defendant finished those 16 shots. And each one of those shots is a crime. Aggravated battery of a firearm. You know what? Dr. Tees even acknowledged on cross-examination that each of these caused injury and each caused blood loss. Now, she said she quibbled about whether or not it was a significant injury or blood loss. Really? You make that decision. Wound number 5, which was the elbow, she says it's not significant. It went in and went out and it broke bones. But in her mind, that's not significant. Ladies and gentlemen, it's definitely significant. She also quibbles about whether or not the 14 or 15 additional shots matter. The evidence is clear that Laquan McDonald was alive each time the defendant shot him. They all mattered. Each separate shot is a crime. Each time the defendant pulled that trigger, and we know he had to physically pull the trigger each time he fired that gun and hit Laquan's body, he committed that offense of aggravated battery with a firearm. And when Laquan, when it was all over this is what his body looked like. Riddled with bullets and injuries. We're going to get another instruction from the court. And this instruction is about causation. And this is the instruction. In order for you to find that the acts of the defendant caused death of Laquan McDonald, the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant's acts were a contributing cause of the death, and that the death did not result from a cause unconnected with the defendant. However, it's not necessary that you find the acts of the defendant were the sole and immediate cause of death. Now that's sort of confusing, because we know all the acts of the defendant were the sole cause and the immediate cause of his death. So basically what this instruction is telling you is that all of the acts contributed. Laquan was entitled to the best chance of his survival. Each shot robbed him of that chance of survival. It's certainly possible the shot to the head and the hand might not have caused his death that night, but they all contributed because he bled. This last moments of his life are important. The defendant made those last moments of his life a nightmare. He riddled his body with bullet after bullet. That's why every shot matters, because it shortened his life. It certainly mattered to Laquan McDonald. Now, the judge is also getting to give you an instruction as to official misconduct. The defendant is charged with 1 count of official misconduct. To sustain the charge of official misconduct, the state must prove the following propositions. The first proposition, that the defendant was a public employee, and second proposition, that when in his official capacity, the defendant knowingly performed an act which he was forbidden to perform. And the third proposition, the defendant was not justified in using the force which he used. If you find from the consideration of all the evidence that each one of these propositions has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant guilty. If you find from your consideration of all the evidence that any one of these propositions has not been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, you should find the defendant guilty. So again, 3 propositions. 1, the defendant was a public employee. He's a Chicago police officer. He's a public employee. That when in his official capacity, you know he was on duty in his official capacity as a police officer, and that he knowingly performed an act which he was forbidden to perform. That act is using deadly force when it was not necessary or reasonable. That's the act of official misconduct. That's the act of first-degree murder and those 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm. Now, from the very beginning, the defendant has exaggerated the threat. Do you recall? He told Detective March, the detective who was on the scene that night, that when McDonald was within 10 to 15 feet of him, McDonald looked at him and raised the knife across his chest, over his shoulder, pointing the knife at him. He also told the detective that in defense of his life, he backpedaled and fired a handgun at McDonald to stop the attack. He told him that he continued to fire the weapon at McDonald as McDonald was on the ground and McDonald appeared to be attempting to get up. None of that happened. You've seen the videos. He made it up to justify the use of deadly force. What did the defendant tell you when he took the stand? He told you that Laquan raised the knife by his side across his body and pointed it to the left. The defendant says it happened. It's not on the video. It's not on the defendant's own animation of what supposedly happened that night. And he couldn't remember on cross, could he, that he told Detective March those things that night. He couldn't remember that he told the detective that night that Laquan had raised the knife over his shoulder and pointed it at him. Well, you have to ask yourself, isn't that convenient that he can't remember that he made that statement or the others? Perhaps that's because those statements and the ones that he made on the witness stand don't line up with the video. He told you on the stand that he opened his car door because he thought he could knock Laquan McDonald down with the car door. You saw the video. Was that even plausible or believable from where his squad car was at? He's 2 lanes away from Laquan McDonald at the point that he opens the door. Now, he told Detective March that night he opened the door because he was going to get out and confront Laquan at that point. But his partner, Walsh, told him to stay in. He says that Laquan McDonald looked at him with an expressionless face and bugged out eyes. He told Dr. Miller that he looked into Laquan's soul. Really? He looked at Laquan McDonald for 6 seconds. 6 seconds before he made the irrevocable decision to shoot him. Not once, but 16 times. Now, he demonstrated that once he realized that Laquan was on the ground, then he brought his gun down. And he brought the gun down, and then he reassessed. And then he tells you, he claims at that point that Laquan is on the ground and trying to push himself up with his left hand, and his left shoulder is coming up. And he's still holding the knife, and he can still see his eyes. And so what does he do? He shoots him again and again. It was his decision to keep shooting, even after he says he reassessed. Well, was his decision to keep shooting or just to finish Laquan off? All of you saw that video. You've seen it numerous times. Does it appear to you that Laquan McDonald was ever getting up after he hit the ground? The answer is no. From the very beginning of this case, the defendant has exaggerated the threat and continues to exaggerate it. The defendant's authority to use deadly force is not unbridled and not without restraint. The defendant used deadly force when he was wearing the badge, when he was wearing a police uniform, and while he was under the cloak of a police officer. And you know what? When deadly force is used, when it's not necessary, when it's not justified, it is first-degree murder. It's 16 counts of aggravated battery, and it is official misconduct. Because no one is above the law.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we're just going to take a short break so that the defense can set up their computer.
All rise for the jury.
All right, will everybody please be seated? Right, Mr. Herbert, Mr. McCann over here. Thank you.
I know.
All right, you ready? All right, court's back in session. Please remain seated. Please remain, thank you. Stand up. All right, Mr. Young.
All rise for the jury.
Will everybody please be seated? Thank you. All right, Mr. Herbert.
Good morning. Let me begin by thanking each and every one of you for your time, your attention throughout these past 3 weeks. On behalf of Jason, on behalf of my trial team, we appreciate it. Time is one of the most important commodities that we have, and we appreciate it. As Judge Gaughan has said several times throughout this case, without people like you, we would not have the form of government that we have. You've been great, but your job is just beginning. Your job is just beginning because now you have to make a determination that decides the fate of Jason Van Dyke, his family.
Judge, I'm going to object.
Stay in the courtroom. Stay in the inner part of the courtroom. Just stand.
It's an important task that you have. And our founding fathers recognized the significance and the importance of trial by one's peers. Jason Van Dyke chose you to decide his fate. And the reason that our founding fathers decided that it's so important, such a fundamental bedrock of our criminal justice system, that somebody can be tried by their peers, it's because the founding fathers recognized that it's us, the people, that can protect somebody against an overzealous prosecutor, protect somebody against tyrannous acts. And that's why Jason Van Dyke chose you guys to decide his fate. You might remember when I first talked to you about this case, and I said, this case is a tragedy. There's no question. But it's not a murder. It's a tragedy, but not a murder. And it's a tragedy that could have been prevented with one simple step. At any point throughout that 20-some minute rampage, and Juan McDonald dropped that knife, he'd be here today. You heard the prosecutor throughout this case, but they've been talking about Laquan and what he did to Laquan, Jason Van Dyke. I would ask you to really don't believe those fake tears by the prosecutors about Laquan. Because had Laquan McDonald dropped that knife and given up, they would have prosecuted him. They would have put him back in that cage that they had him for years prior to him being out on the street that night. So don't believe the fake tears. Ladies and gentlemen, first-degree murder. That's the charges here. first-degree murder. It's unprecedented. It's unprecedented for a police officer who responds to a scene, is called to a scene, comes upon an individual with a knife acting in this strange manner. First-degree murder, no motive, no malice, no premeditation. Well, the state says, well, you'll see the instructions. You don't have to have that. Well, you can use your common sense, ladies and gentlemen, and you can determine what is a murder. This isn't. The charge, the accusation of murder is the most serious accusation that somebody can put on another person. An accusation of murder is branding that person as a murderer for the rest of his life. If the government is going to put that brand on somebody, well, they better have the evidence to back it up. You as a jury can't accept that brand until and only if the state proves the case. Ms. Gleason talked about a lot of things in her close. She wants to, as I told you at the onset 3 weeks ago, the state wants you to watch the last 2 minutes of this movie without knowing the context. They keep talking about this taser. This taser was only 30 seconds away. All right, well, 30 seconds in that situation. First of all, Jason Van Dyke nor anyone else out there knew that this car was 30 seconds away. They want you to think that, but you'll see the transcripts. They never came over here and said, we're almost there. They never even said they had a taser. They asked for a taser, and then a car responded, said they're coming from a distance. But then the prosecutors want you to think, well, he should have just waited 30 seconds, right? Isn't that what the argument is? Well, I think that demonstrates how preposterous their argument is and their charges are in this case. What was Jason Van Dyke supposed to do? Like, tell Mr. McDonald, hold on, we got a taser coming. Was he supposed to run around the car with McDonald chasing him? I know it's preposterous. But in this case, your job is to interpret it how a reasonable police officer would have acted. We as civilians, we can't recognize a lot of things that police officers can. The prosecutors, you know, the most dangerous part of their day is crossing a busy street to go to Starbucks. We have to look at this from Jason Van Dyke's perspective. Probable guilt is not enough. The video is not enough. Ask yourself, from the state's opening, when they showed that video, did their case get any better? Did they have one witness get up there and say, that wasn't reasonable? They had Yuri Patrick, who said it wasn't reasonable, but Yuri Patrick, they made Yuri Patrick watch the last 2 minutes of the movie without showing him the context. They blew up the shot of Laquan McDonald flicking out his knife. Remember seeing that blown up? Why wouldn't you show that to Yuri Patrick? He never saw it. How about Rudy Grillis attempted to be stabbed moments earlier? Why would you hide that fact from your expert? Because they needed to get an opinion. And you'll see what happens with his opinion. I've been doing this a long time. Normally, you're lucky to get 2 or 3 good points out of the other side's witnesses. I want you to look at this case, this state's case, and tell me Did they prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt? These questions,
I'm going to object. This is a statement of law and that exceeds the
All right,
scope.
take it down. So you can argue it.
sure, the judge we disclosed it to him last night.
But don't
Why
make
we're
it
objecting
difference,
now.
it's still the law. I'll instruct that in law.
So I cannot get into any portions of the
You
law.
you can argue, but you're not going to submit the statements from a public decision.
You remember when you spoke, or when Judge Gahn spoke to you early on? And he
All right,
told,
when I say take it down, Ms. Fleming, take it down. You understand me?
and he told you that you have to presume the defendant innocent. That presumption goes all the way through every proceeding here. It goes through until you go back there and you look to see, did the state prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond a doubt based on reason? Let's look at their evidence. Their evidence, their case. I will submit to you that each of these points, and there's a lot of them, each one independently is reasonable doubt. It's for you to determine what the evidence is. Take a look at these facts, please. This is the first police officer, McGilligan, that was on the scene. How soon after you get out of the car did he flip open that knife? Within seconds. Within seconds? That raised the threat level, didn't it? Sure did, or yes. Flipped out a knife with you within what, 10 feet away from him? Yes. So you pull your gun, right? Yes. Officer McGilligan pulls his gun, Laquan pulls out his knife, McGilligan ready to shoot if needed. So you followed him from 10 to 15 feet away with your gun drawn. He had his knife up, right? Yeah. That was a block away from the Burger King. True? It's less than a block. Less than a block away. And that's when he attacked your tire, right? Yes. And he attacked the windshield, right? Yes. When Officer Gaffney, who was sitting in the car, attempted to cut Laquan McDonald off with the vehicle, did you at any time observe Laquan McDonald stumble in any way? There was. When he met with the vehicle, he stumbled and spun. And that's when he swung the knife at the tire. Here's the theme, ladies and gentlemen. We've talked about it in opening, and you see it throughout this case. Confrontation. Laquan McDonald gets confronted. What happens? He attacks. He's confronted by Rudy Brillis. What happened? He attacked. He's confronted by the police officers here. He attacks. Thankfully, he didn't harm a police officer, but he attacks. Threat level is rising each and every time as Jason Van Dyke gets to the scene. Still McGilligan. What if anything happened when Officer Gaffney tried to cut off Laquan McDonald the second time? He swung the knife at the window. By stabbing the tire and stabbing the windshield, he has clearly raised the threat level, has he not? Yes, he has. And there are trucks parked there, correct? Yes. There are people parked there. People park their cars there, right? Yes. Again, threat level rising. And this is when Jason Van Dyke first comes on the scene. He needs to cut Laquan McDonald off from getting into that park. And you heard, I think over the radio, I think you testified that you may have heard somebody might have been calling the page. Yes. You don't know where that person was coming from, right? I didn't know, no. And you didn't know how long it would take for them to get there, correct? Correct. State makes a big point about, well, McGilligan didn't shoot him. Well, McGilligan had a completely different interaction with Laquan McDonald than Jason Van Dyke. It is of no relevance, as their expert witness will testify to. He would have turned and started walking towards you with that knife. That would have changed the situation completely. Yes. 30 times McGilligan tells him to drop his knife. Next witness, state's witness. State's witness to prove its case. Officer Joe Walsh, remember him up on the witness stand. Prove the case for the state. Question, these videos don't show your perspective of what happened, correct? Not at all. These videos are from behind the gun, right? Correct. The state's only evidence that they can argue with the straight face is this video. Well, the video is essentially meaningless based upon all the testimony that we've received. And we'll get into that. It shows a perspective, but not the right perspective. So we can't view just that video. That's what the state wants you to do. That's why they played an opening, and their case from there went downhill. So you're looking at it from a completely different perspective than what everybody in here is seeing, correct? Yes. Joe Walsh, this is the only individual that was in a position that is anywhere remotely close to where Jason Van Dyke was. The only person. So I assumed that he was going to give the testimony that, wow, I shouldn't have shot him. I wouldn't have shot him. He doesn't. Talks about trying to keep him out of the Burger King. Talks about trying to keep him away from people. That was their intent. That was his mindset. Let's take a look at your perspective, Mr. Walsh. You pull up and another police car had just passed you. Is that right? Yes. They are going north, away from where you're going. Correct? Yes. That was Officer Velez, who we'll get to in a minute. But remember the significance. Officer Velez pulls her vehicle away, Parker does, who's driving, because she's scared to death. He's scared to death. Because they know he's got a knife, but they think he's got a gun. They pull away. Is that significant? Did Jason Van Dyke think he had a gun at that point? No, that's quite truthful. But it's significant from the standpoint that last line of defense. Who was it? Jason Van Dyke. You're the only person there, Officer Walsh again, that can stop him at that point. That's what I believe. Last line of defense. You're trying to keep this guy with the knife. He's already damaged the police car. Trying to keep away from people. That was my mindset. You had your gun drawn. I did. You had it drawn because he was a danger, was he not? I believe he was. When you get out of the car, you had to walk behind Officer Van Dyke, right? Initially, I was ahead of him. You had your gun out because you were prepared to shoot if you had to. Is that right? Yes. Training. He talks about the 21-foot rule. Remember that? The rule is within 21 feet, if your weapon is holstered, the belief is, or the drill they refer to is, within 21 feet, an individual armed is going to stab you, and you may be lucky to get off 2 shots per the drill or study that has been in existence since 1983. Well, we know that it takes about a second and a half for the climb down to close the distance that he had on Jason Van Dyke. We know that from testimony, state's witnesses as well, and you saw the demonstration, Mr. Barry Broad. Quick, somebody coming at you with a knife. Walsh tells him 3 or 4 times to drop his knife. Keeps walking towards you. Keeps walking towards you. Huge part about the state's case. Laquan Down was walking away. He wasn't, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I don't know what Laquan would have done. I don't know if he would have attacked Jason Van Dyke. None of us do. But it's irrelevant to our analysis there. He wasn't walking away. The video shows that he crosses over that line. But again, we're not disputing that he did cross over that line. But does it show that he's walking away? If you wanted to go to that fence, like I told you in opening, he could have hopped that thing probably without even touching it. He could have climbed that thing in a second. He didn't do that. He changed his behavior. Remember? From running away to, okay, slow skip. Why? Prepared to attack. And even if he wasn't, it was reasonable for Jason to do that. And that's what the evidence shows there. step forward. Big deal about, well, you didn't shoot him. Well, didn't say I wouldn't shot him. I was confident that Officer Van Dyke took necessary actions to save himself and myself. So you would have shot him if you had to, right? Yes. Right there. It's game over. If the only person, the state's evidence, the only person that is even close to the perspective of Jason Van Dyke, he says it's reasonable. That's the basis. Based upon a reasonable police officer. Their case, their evidence. Have you been a danger to the public? Yes. Video. State's only evidence. They blow it up. They blow it up to show him flicking out the knife. Right there. The arrow. What is the arrow that the state put in there? What is the arrow showing? Exactly what Joe Walsh showed when he demonstrated. At that point, Juan McDonald turned and raised the knife over his shoulder. The state wants you to think that that Jason Van Dyke raised it over his shoulder like this. He didn't. Raised it over his shoulder, looked right at him, targeting, changed his stance. Officer Reddick, or Paul Reddick, state's witness. In fact, cameras, watching a camera, it's not the same as watching with their eyes, correct? That's correct. Remember, he was the video guy. What are some of the inherent problems with video as opposed to seeing it with your own two eyes? Aside from the fact that it doesn't capture everything on the number of stills. There's numerous differences. Color may be different from camera to your eye. Contrast. Video system might not capture the same as colors, but it's colors and it's typo that you can see with your eyes. Distorts images. Yes, it may. Two-dimensional, right? Yeah, correct. Difficult to judge proper depth on a video, right? State's witness. It can be, but very different than it would with your naked eye. And that's because it's two-dimensional, correct? And so distances are distorted, correct? They can. Dora Fontaine, remember that the female police officer that came, that she arrived just after the shooting. She didn't see the shooting, she said, but she does talk about some facts that are certainly helpful to defense, again, from the state's witnesses. Walking southbound with a knife, swaying a knife, Dora Fontaine. That's what Jason said. That's what Joe Walsh said. When you say swaying, what do you mean? Swaying it back and forth. That's what Jason said. That's what Joe Walsh said. I remember being asked, I want to ask you, Officer Fontaine, based on your training experience, as the subject is lying on the ground here, is he any longer a risk of life and death, physical injury to you? Your answer was, he still has a weapon. As long as he has a weapon, yes. And that's your answer, yes. That would be your answer today, yes. Yuri Patrick, the state's witness. You're going to see, I'm going to show you a number of factors that you can look at for the state's expert witness on the critical issue. What does he say? Does he prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt for the state? I don't think so. McDonald was a risk, and he needed to be confronted. And that was before you knew that he tried to stab some guy twice, right? Yes, I didn't know that. You would agree with me that this knife is a deadly weapon. It can't be, yes. Why is a knife such as this a deadly weapon? because it can inflict serious injury and even death upon people. How much damage can, remember the question I asked him, I said, how much damage can a knife do? His answer was great. Pause. A lot. How about a bulletproof vest? No protection from stabbing. It could penetrate the vest. That's what I said. You talked earlier about when police officers shoot. They don't shoot to kill people, correct? Correct. They shoot to eliminate the threat, correct? Yes. In fact, police officers don't shoot because they want to kill somebody, correct? I agree. Important. The state has to prove Jason Van Dyke guilty of all the charges that it filed, but also every single element within those charges. If they don't prove every element within those charges, it has to be not guilty. Intent. Their witness is no intent to kill. The intent is to neutralize the threat. That's it. Ask specifically, Yuri Patrick, their witness. Jason Van Dyke's behavior, did you believe that he was shooting to eliminate the threat, whether reasonable or not? I have no reason to believe that was not his motivation. To kill him. That's not their goal. They're trained to continue shooting until they perceive that the threat has ended. Because frequently, police officers miss with more shots than they hit with. And the effects of wounds take time to accumulate. That's exactly what Jason Van Dyke said. It's exactly what he was experiencing. Asked specifically about the question of 21 feet, person with a knife at 21 feet. They can get to you before you can recognize a threat. Draw and fire your weapon. It's a training meant to heighten awareness that someone 20 to 30 feet away from you can be a threat. Their witness. Jason Van Dyke reloaded after emptying his firearm. State made a big deal about that, remember? Why? Because they have no case. They have no evidence. The fact that Jason Van Dyke reloaded his weapon, significance in any way? Yuri Patrick, their witness. Not in my mind. In fact, it's immaterial to your analysis, correct? I would agree that when an officer starts shooting, when he stops shooting, however long or however many rounds that it takes, it's all a continuous event. It is not separate events that have to be separated, separately assessed and judged, if you will. Very, very important, ladies and gentlemen. The state has decided to charge 16 separate counts of aggravated battery. It is all one physical act. They have to prove that he had intent to fire each one of those separately. They can't. It's one continuous act. Yuri Patrick, right at the bottom here, asked about other police officers. They made a big deal about, well, there was this officer on the scene, he didn't shoot. This officer on the scene, he didn't shoot. Yuri Patrick, well, the only perspective that's relevant to your analysis would be the perspective of Jason Van Dyke. Would be an examination of the circumstances from his perspective, not from the perspective of this card cam video. Their witness. Game over. Talks about imminent threat. Imminent threat is one that doesn't necessarily have to happen, but could happen. Yeah, when he turns with that knife over his shoulder, we don't know. Maybe he would have dropped the knife after that. Maybe he would have turned back and ran over the fence. We don't know. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter according to the state's witness. Doesn't have to happen, but it could happen. Yuri Patrick, police officer doesn't have to wait until somebody inflicts injury on them before it would be reasonable fire. That's correct. Yuri Patrick, again, he was a great witness. Police officers are always reacting to what the person they are interacting with does. And you would agree with me, I asked them this question, you would agree with me that a police officer is not required to trust that this individual had faith in his good graces and doesn't have to trust that this person will just give up, right? That's correct. And along those same lines, this isn't like a boxing match or a sanctioned event. The police don't have to give the person that they're encountering, they don't have to give them a fair chance, do they? No. They're taught to use, once they make the decision to use deadly force, to continue to use it until they perceive that the threat has ended. That's their witness. And important with Yuri Patrick as well. You heard it from Yuri Patrick, you heard it from Paul Redding, you heard it from Dr. Miller, you heard it from Nick Pappas, which we'll get into. When a police officer starts to fire their weapon, they fire as quick as they can and get as many rounds out as they can until they recognize that the threat has been neutralized. The state wants you to look at that video and say, as soon as Laquan McDonald fell on the ground, there couldn't have been any more shots. It's not true. It's not true. It's not what their witness said. It's not what the evidence is in this case. A police officer can fire. We have evidence of it. The FBI tested it. Remember, the state didn't want to put that video in, but we put it in, of the person that had similar skills to Jason Van Dyke. 6 shots in 1 second. State said, well, it took him only 1.5 seconds to fall. Okay, that's 9 shots right there. And then, what did Yuri Patrick, what did every other witness say? It takes up to 1.5 seconds to realize that a threat has been neutralized. It takes up to 1.5 seconds for your eyes to see the threat be neutralized, get back to your brain, tell your brain to stop shooting. It's another 1.5 seconds. That's 9 more shots. That's 18 shots that their witness justified Jason Van Dyke using. He didn't fire 18 shots. There's a lot more on Yuri Patrick. I'm sure you have notes on it. But I think we've identified the key points for him. Now, Yuri Patrick talks about things that indicate reasonable police officers that a threat may be happening. Okay? And this is important because if Laquan McDonald did not appear to be some kid whacked out on PCP, acting really bizarrely, if this was a kid in a Boy Scout uniform, just walking down the street with a knife, and Jason Van Dyke shot him, yeah, probably wouldn't be justified, but it's not. Yuri Patrick says you got to look for those signs. You're a police officer, they're witness. Yuri Patrick, you remember when I asked him about, well, he was a witness for the state. Well, I said, well, in fact, you recently testified in a case where you found a police officer's actions were reasonable when an individual raised a stick and they were within 8 to 10 feet of that police officer. When they raised it as they attacked the police officer. Raised the stick, the shooting happened, 8 to 10 feet away. That's good, but a knife? Not as dangerous as a stick. Targeting. Yuri Patrick, he talks about that. He talked about targeting. When an individual is watching the officer, paying attention to the officer. It's an important point here. Signs of a disturbed individual, signs of a potential threat, we heard it from their witnesses. Somebody that doesn't make eye contact, somebody that doesn't respond to dozens and dozens of police commands, marked squad cars flying in every direction, somebody just walking down the street, not making eye contact, that's a sign of an imminent threat, testified by their witnesses. But how about when remember we talked about this in opening? I said, think about a monster movie, excuse me. Think about a monster movie. When they're walking down the street and say there's the victim is hiding in the bush, you know, there's not much danger here. But when that monster suddenly stops and turns and looks right at that victim in the bush, I think I said that's when the music starts to play. That's when the filmmakers are like, okay, I got him right now. Jason Van Dyke wasn't a movie. It wasn't the video. This was real life. You're Patrick still. No way of knowing what Jason Van Dyke was seeing, experiencing, or capturing. I haven't talked with him. Important. Because the only way to fully, if you don't have video from somebody's perspective, yeah, you could have talked to Joe Walsh. He didn't talk to Joe Walsh. Joe Walsh would have said, this is what I saw. I would have shot the guy. He was a danger. They didn't. They didn't talk to Jason Van Dyke. Well, State made a big point about how Jason Van Dyke spoke to our witnesses. He spoke to Larry Miller. He spoke to Barry Brott. What's wrong with that? That's how you provide in-depth analysis. That's how you get the context for the full 2-hour movie, instead of showing the last 2 minutes. Your video states only evidence. That portion, that's not the same as seeing that in real life. Yes. Dr. Miller, remember his testimony? Pretty hard to read. Try my best here. So the main difference is, for most of us, if we're faced with danger, our brains are telling us to do whatever you can to get away from the danger. If your car is skidding off the road, correct it. If someone is chasing you, elude them. If the house is on fire, get out of it. First responders, police officers, their task is a little different, because even though the brains are telling them to run, get away, save yourself, their job is exactly to do the opposite. They have to run towards the danger. Different than what an average civilian. The average civilian, like you and I, is heightened that danger, heightened that threat level. And therefore, the types of reaction that we see are probably a little more common. The threat level, the actions of Roy McDonald on the ground, Jason Van Dyke saw them a lot different than what was on that video. He saw it different for a number of reasons. One, because that video doesn't capture it properly. Now, all the other witnesses saw him moving. But does it show him about to get up? Does it show him, up to his knees and about to get up? No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But you know who it would look like that to? Somebody that just had to use his gun for the first time in his career, working in the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. That person, just seconds after he had to shoot somebody, the threat looked bigger, it looked closer. Does that mean Jason Van Dyke is a weak person? Does that mean that he has some mental problems that prevent him from being a reasonable police officer? No. That's exactly how police officers in that situation would respond. Statements talked about, Jason Van Dyke, he said, we're going to have to kill this guy. Somehow, that is some negative connotation towards Jason Van Dyke. Some connotation that Jason Van Dyke was going to shoot this guy because, as they say, Jason was angry that this guy was not listening to them. You see any evidence of that? Jason was angry at the young black boy Remember that in opening? If you see any evidence that race had anything to do with this case, when you don't have evidence, you use argument. When you go back there, you can't listen to the arguments. Put them out of your mind. The evidence came from this witness stand and were exhibits that Judge Gahn entered into evidence. And you'll get those back. There. Reasonable. Is it reasonable for Jason Van Dyke to experience what he said he was experiencing? Well, he was unfair. Any reasonable police officer hearing that fellow officers are being attacked would be alert to a threat. That goes to his comment that he made to Joe Walsh. When Jason Van Dyke hears that police officers are attacked, that's a big deal. The state wants you to think, well, they just popped his tire. And he was just playing around. Nobody was afraid. Nobody was scared. Well, why didn't you call Mr. Gaffney in here to say, yeah, it was nothing. Just a little misunderstanding. Why? Because Gaffney would have said, I was scared to death, just like any police officer in that situation would have done.
Disregard what Officer Gaffney would have testified. He was not a witness. There was no testimony about what he would have done.
That would be sustained. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Gaffney did not testify. That is not evidence. So disregard that statement made by Mr. Herbert.
And in fact, after Joe Walsh testified, you didn't hear from any of those other officers on the scene, right? Why not? Joe Walsh approved their case. Game over. Dr. O'Donnell, pharmacologist, interprets the results for Jason Van Dyke. Valproic acid and risperidone, antipsychotic medicine. Jason Van Dyke Laquan McDonald was prescribed those, had not been taking them within the recent past of when he was killed. Significance of that? Yes, when coupled with PCP. Use PCP within a relatively recent time period. Well, tell me about PCP at the levels that Laquan McDonald was tested at. And remember that this is 56 nanograms, I think it's supposed to be. But anyways, this is from the cavity blood. Remember, we heard from the doctor, we heard from Dr. Tees, we heard from the ER doctor. This is from cavity blood. This is after they have already diluted the blood from the treatment. So they said the levels were probably higher than this. But even at this level, assuming that this was the correct level, what can it do? Delusions, behavioral changes, aggressions, violence. Aggressive and violence. The effect of this antipsychotic medication, not taking that. Second line, third line there, in PCP, even in a patient without any psychiatric illness or any mental illness, can cause severe psychiatric toxicity. He took the psychotropic drug PCP, phencyclidine, which can cause severe rage, aggression, violent behavior. Well, Jason Van Dyke didn't know that. Laquan McDonald, blood level was 56 nanograms of PCP. Agreed. But those symptoms of rage, aggression, violent behavior, drug-induced psychosis, that describes Laquan McDonald. Yeah, Jason Van Dyke recognized it. Did he know it was exactly PCP? Of course not. Did he as a police officer recognize that this guy was whacked out? Absolutely. Did that play a factor in his role to shoot? There's no question. Nick Pattis, slide lock. Remember, he was our training instructor. State makes a big deal. He reloaded. Slide lock. The weapon should be immediately reloaded. That's how they're trained and drilled on that from the very beginning. Knives are more dangerous than guns in certain situations. How quick can somebody cover 7 yards, 21 feet? almost double the feat of what we have in the situation that Jason Van Dyke encountered with Juan McDonald right before he shot. 1.5 seconds. Yeah, but that's from somebody that is standing still, not from somebody that is already in motion, like with Juan McDonald. So that time would have been less, correct? Intent. Again, Yuri Patrick, Jason Van Dyke didn't have any intent to kill this guy, state's witness. Mr. Pappas, police officer's intent in shooting. It's to eliminate the threat, right? Yes. How about when he's on the ground, Mr. Pappas? Does that mean that can he still be considered a threat? Certainly can be, yes. Why? Because they could get up and re-attack. This officer Velez, remember she was talking about how she thought that Laquan McDonald had the gun and her partner drove away because they were so afraid. She sees Laquan McDonald. He looks deranged, just like Jason saw it. And she points to the points that I'm making. You know, this is bizarre behavior. We had lights, sirens. He was not looking in our direction. There was nothing phasing him. He was like he was in the twilight, holding his side, thought he had a gun. Rudy Brillis, the working man, comes home from a long day's work. Little did he know he was going to encounter the burglar, Laquan McDonald. Laquan got in there. We don't know how, but the gate was locked, right? Yes. What'd you see? Another person inside the truck. It's burglary, ladies and gentlemen. It's a burglary. And that's significant. When we get to the peace officer's use of force statute and allowing somebody to use deadly force. Got out of the truck, asked the person to leave. He didn't. What'd you do? Call the police. Did he continue to advance towards you? This is our first sign of Laquan being confronted that night. Consistent. Continue to advance towards you. How close did he get? About 3 feet. What did he do? Pulled out a knife and he wanted to hurt me. What did he do with that knife? He came towards me. He tried to stab me. Remember? Been demonstrated. Threw his phone at him. He flees when the police come. The police that night saved Rudy Brillis. He couldn't talk, he was tongue-tied. Remember the testimony about that knife that looks like a gun that looks like a knife. Jason Van Dyke, was he thinking that as he was firing his weapon? Probably not, but was it in the back of his mind? He received it in training role, officer safety role. A lot of things in a reasonable police officer's mind. Miss Alexander, remember she talked about Laquan and his past. Well, Jason didn't know about that. Doesn't matter. You'll get a jury instruction on it. Talks about putting a slug in a judge's head. Dr. Tease, she's clear. Cause of death. Gunshot wound, I'm sorry, number 4. The state, in their case, they want you to believe that every single bullet, every single shot contributed to the death of Laquan McDonald. It's not true. It's not true. Dr. Tease gave it. So what are they going to do to counter that? Bring in the pathologist that just wrote those, a couple of words in there, kind of a cut and paste. Pulpification and hemorrhage. It's kind of thrown in after description of each shot. They didn't bring that person in. Remember Dr. Ruckmar? Yep, we can't find her. She's somewhere in Texas. Why didn't that person come in? Because that's the only evidence that they have that every shot contributed to the death was a couple of words that I argued were cut and paste and put in a report. Why didn't they bring her in? Because she screwed up. And she knew that if she came in to testify, that's what she'd have to say. So can you rely on Dr. Arukamar to rebut Dr. Tease? No. Dr. Arukamar is doing nothing more than what the state did and what civilians will do. Read something on a sheet of paper and assume that it's true, despite the evidence to the contrary. No evidence to the contrary. Bleeding from every gunshot? Really? Why wasn't there a lot of blood on the scene? They called Deputy Murphy in yesterday to show there was a lot of blood on the scene. How much was there? Half a cup? Yeah, that sounds about right. Half a cup. If you're bleeding from every extremity, there's not going to be more than half a cup. Where was the blood? It was all in here. Why was it all in here? Because he was killed with that first or second shot as he was turned to face Jason Van Dyke with his knife raised, ready to attack. The rest of it, I'm sorry?
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. The rest of those shots, irrelevant. At that point. Jason Freaks, demonstration. State makes a big deal about, the state's own video doesn't show Juan McDonald raising the knife when he turns. So what? Jason Freaks was not here to do a video game reenacting to show all the movements of Juan McDonald. He was here to show the distance between Juan McDonald and Jason Van Dyke. If we had him put in all these things, he said, I think the conservative approach. My analysis is to show the distances. And if you look at that distance, I think it gives a better perspective, but it's still not Jason Van Dyke's. Got Patterson, he talks about, he's got shoots 80,000 rounds a year, I think he said. When I asked him, do you ever shoot on the range, you just empty your gun, shoot all 16 rounds? Oh yeah. Do you have the intent to fire each one of those rounds? No, you just fire. You empty the gun. Very broad. What's your opinion? Violence was justified. Finishing up here, ladies and gentlemen. All of those factors that I've just discussed, as I said, each and every one of them individually is reasonable doubt. The state proved its case. Not even close. But we just been talking about the Jason Van Dyke's being in reasonable fear for his life, and that's when he fired. That's what we've been talking about. But remember when I told you in opening, and I showed you the same slide that I'm going to show you right now. I told you that there's a statute out here, look at this jury instruction, and it talks about situations in which police officers can use deadly force even when it has nothing to do with protecting themselves or somebody else. And I told you in the opening, I'm like, I don't know what the state's going to argue, but there's no evidence to rebut, to dispute what we're showing here. Remember, we had Miss Sayre from the police academy talk about this. Police officer need not retreat or desist from efforts to make a lawful arrest because of resistance. He's justified in using force likely to cause death or great bodily harm. That's an offensive life portion. Or, even if you're not afraid for your life or somebody else's life, here's where the difference between us, a regular citizen, and a police officer. They're allowed to use deadly force to prevent the arrest from being defeated by resistance or escape, and the person to be arrested has committed or attempted a forcible felony, which involves the infliction or threatened infliction of great bodily harm. He certainly threatened to kill Rudy Bareilles, didn't he? He certainly threatened Officer Gaffney in that vehicle. Right there alone, he can shoot Jason Van Dyke. Or even if you didn't think he met that category. The person to be arrested is attempting to escape by use of a deadly weapon. Was Jason Van Dyke trying to escape by use of a deadly weapon? But for this weapon, he dropped it, he would have been under arrest. The weapon was the only thing that prevented the police from arresting Jason Van Dyke. With Juan McDonald, excuse me. Or, even if you don't buy that one, This individual indicates that he will endanger human life or inflict great bodily harm unless arrested without delay. Ladies and gentlemen, in closing here, thank you for the additional time, Judge. In closing here, ladies and gentlemen,
You have plenty of time, you have 5 minutes.
oh, do I? Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the police saved Rudy Brillos that night. They saved him because when they arrived, that skirted Laquan McDonald off. Police are here to serve and protect. Remember I showed you the SWAT car video. They can't retreat. They can't run away like us. And they have to encounter people that create their own destiny. I told you, Laquan McDonald was the author, the choreographer of this story. Jason Van Dyke had to be brought into it. So I'm going to ask you, when you go back to the jury room, you can start deliberating with your fellow jurors. Remember that, you know, sometimes the right decision is not always the easiest decision. But you owe it to yourself to make the right decision here. Because nobody can fault you for making the right decision. You follow your heart, you follow your soul, you follow your mind. You also owe it to Jason Van Dyke. He chose you. He chose you, he's putting his fate in your hands. We also owe it to our city, our county, our country. You have a very important job here. It's a critical task. I'm going to ask you to follow your hearts, follow your minds, and do what you're required to do here, which is to base your decision based upon the evidence. This is a grassroots case where we're going back to the jurors to decide this, because the people can decide, not looking through rose-colored glasses, not looking based upon motivation for politics. It's you, the citizens. Give Jason Van Dyke the benefit. He's innocent right now until you go in that room and say he's guilty. The only way you can do that is based on the evidence. And if you review the evidence fair, impartially, I think there's really only one decision you can make, and that's not guilty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Earl. Ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to take another short break while we switch over to the computer.
All rise for the jury.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 10-minute recess. Court's in recess.
All rise for the jury.
Will everybody please be seated? Mr. McMahon?
Thank you. We're here because Jason Van Dyke didn't value the life of LaQuan McDonald enough to do anything but shoot him. In fact, we know defendant Jason Van Dyke was contemplating shooting LaQuan before he even arrived, before he ever laid eyes on LaQuan McDonald. Mr. Herbert, just a couple minutes ago, said a couple of things that I want to talk about briefly. One of the things that caught my attention was, and I think this is a quote, a Boy Scout doing the exact same thing, that probably wouldn't be reasonable. We wouldn't be here. What's the difference between a Boy Scout acting the way LaQuan was and LaQuan McDonald? You're going to get all the law in this case. All the law in the state of Illinois that applies to the facts of this case. That law is going to come from Judge Gaughan. What you're not going to consider, because it doesn't apply to this case, is motive or malice or premeditation. The jury instructions that Judge Gaughan will read to you and you will take back to your deliberation room is all the law that applies to the facts of this case. And nowhere will you read a thing about motive, malice, or premeditation. It's not relevant. It's not part of your deliberations. And it's not anything that the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Here's everything the defendant knew and heard when he made the decision to shoot LaQuan McDonald.
Radio before we know. They're waiting for you. Anybody ever get there on 401 kilo for 13 Robert? We're differentiating their defender. Archer and Logan. Can you talk to anyone else out there? 401 killer with a taser. You want to everybody is on what else? Storage police, and on 40th Street. Yeah. Anybody close yet? 401 Keeler. I got a whole thing of playing home state, Mr. Robert, asking for a visa for up to Thunder tonight. Anybody close? Or, they're more by. 2010 Robert, Jeff Ford, yeah, first year with him, let me know. 15 Robert, Carlos, good, or you had 4 by flat, yeah. We're going to Virgin. And into the Virgin.
That's what he heard. That's what he heard. What he saw was the following. The first arrow that Mr. Herbert talked about, testimony that came from that witness stand is that that arrow represents evidence of the first shot. That arrow, first visual evidence of Laquan McDonald being shot by Jason Van Dyke. When the defendant took that witness stand, he claims that he killed Laquan McDonald for 4 reasons. 1, he had a knife. 2, Laquan was within 12 to 15 feet of Jason Van Dyke. 3, Van Dyke told him to drop the knife, and Laquan ignored it. And 4, Laquan had big, bulging eyes, and he looked right at him. Based on those 4 reasons alone, the defendant told you it was necessary to shoot and continue to shoot Laquan McDonald until he lay motionless on Pulaski. Let's explore those claims in detail in the context of everything that happened October 20th, and compare what the defendant did with what was necessary by every other police officer and citizen that encountered Laquan in any way that night, from the truck yard to the moment of his death. First, it was Mr. Rudy Barillas and his wife confronting Laquan in the truck yard. Laquan standing over Mr. Barillas and his wife 3 feet away, and with that exact same knife that Laquan had in his hand out on Pulaski. What was necessary to fend off Laquan in that dark and isolated truck yard? In that vulnerable position when Mr. Barillas bends down and grabs a handful of rocks or stones? He threw his cell phone and the stones, and Laquan left to avoid the confrontation. Not a scratch on Mr. Barillas or his wife. They were untouched. Mr. Barillas doesn't have the benefit of law enforcement training, backup officers, or time. He fended off Laquan McDonald with a cell phone and a fistful of rocks. Mr. Barillas and his wife, they were faced with a far worse threat from Laquan McDonald than the defendant was. And he had none of the training or the resources that were available to Jason Van Dyke. How about Officer McElligott walking down 40th Street? For a 3, 4, maybe 5 block distance, he and Laquan are on the sidewalk and off the sidewalk. And later, when they try to cut him off, Laquan hits the squad, popping the tire and hitting the windshield. Officer McElligott told you that Laquan's 10 to 15 feet away from him, face to face with Laquan. Laquan has that exact same knife in his hand. He says Laquan is non-responsive. He says Laquan is mumbling. Officer McElligott is alone on the street without the 9 other officers that are going to show up with Jason Van Dyke and surround Laquan. That situation is even more confrontational than what Jason Van Dyke faced when he shot Laquan on Pulaski. McElligott doesn't shoot. He doesn't shoot because it wasn't necessary. He was buying time, calling for backup, calling for a taser. McElligott was in nearly the exact same situation as Jason Van Dyke, probably worse. McElligott buys time, waits for the taser, and he continues to follow Laquan. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about what was necessary during this entire trial. This encounter demonstrates exactly why it wasn't necessary to shoot Laquan McDonald. And no matter how loudly or dramatically Mr. Herbert argues, this proves it was not necessary to shoot Laquan McDonald. Jason Van Dyke, far more resources available to him. Officer McElligott, he exercised patience. Jason Van Dyke chose not to, and instead used his gun. The knife, the distance, the defiance, and the look in the eyes. Those are the 4 things